For our next panel discussion, please welcome Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law School, Hannah Garry, Associate Professor of the Practice of Human Rights at USC, Steve Swerdlow, and Managing Director of the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, Maral Tavitian.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's such a pleasure to be on stage with my former professor, Hannah Garry, and my dear USC colleague, Steve Swerdlow, a friend of the Institute. Both of you are doing such tremendous work on Artsakh in your respective capacities, which we'll get to very shortly. But I wanted to start off by asking you a question that's connected to the title of today's panel, which is, given both of your backgrounds as legal practitioners, what brought you to the university as a forum for addressing human rights issues? Steve, do you want to go ahead?
First, I just want to say a huge thank you, and a huge thank you to Shushan, the staff of this wonderful institute that I've had the honor of collaborating with for the last 5 years here at USC. My journey begins in education as well. My mentors, like Dr. Stepanos Dorian, who gave a lecture here this morning, was one of those people that shaped my interest and inspired the passion in me to begin learning about the region. After I left college, I started working for a human rights organization called the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews in Russia and the Caucasus. And I got to visit all three republics, including Artsakh. And at that time, Artsakh was still very much freshly struggling after the ceasefire of '94. And I watched with awe and amazement over the years as these institutions of democracy and human rights, such as the Office for the Ombudsman of Human Rights in the Republic of Artsakh, started to form. And I started to watch this building of a democracy in a fledgling and embattled republic. And yet that achievement was so inspiring to me. I then had the opportunity, working for Human Rights Watch, to really follow the crackdown in Azerbaijan, the vicious and relentless, persistent campaign of arresting human rights defenders, political opponents, journalists, which continues right up to the present time. And then when I arrived here, working with my students, I got to help them get involved in looking at things such as Armenophobia as an international human rights abuse in the context of the Convention on on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And we're very involved here now in trying to raise awareness and the profile and the plight of Armenian political prisoners held captive in Azerbaijan, of which there are at least 23. So a lot of efforts, a lot of continuous experiences, but they all began with mentors in education.
So I also just want to echo Steve and say a huge thank you to USC's Institute for Armenian Studies, for Shushan, for Maral. It's just wonderful to be back here. I taught at USC Gould School of Law for 13 years, and it's wonderful to be back. Like Steve, my career in human rights work and advocacy really actually started in academia, not as a practitioner. When I was a researcher in the field with Oxford University's Refugee Studies program in East Africa, based in Uganda. And I spent about 2.5 years doing a project looking at rights in exile for refugees, and to what extent do refugees enjoy the rights they're entitled to as human beings under international law, and particularly to protection under refugee law. And I was really intrigued by that question as a socio-legal researcher, because what I was seeing on the ground in refugee camps and in interviewing individuals living in the urban areas who were fleeing from the Rwandan genocide, who were fleeing from South Sudan, who were fleeing from the Eritrea-Ethiopia border conflict, who were fleeing from the Democratic Republic of Congo, was that in fact they were being treated as second-class citizens at best in exile. And there was no protection. In fact, they were being targeted in refugee camps, trapped. And so I spent 2.5 years documenting, and and through that experience, realized the power, first of all, of young graduate students like myself in having fresh eyes and coming and asking those hard questions to document and to try to inform and influence policy at the UN level, but also with host governments to live up to their obligations under international law for protection of refugees. And as a result of that research, we were able to set up the first legal aid clinic for refugees in Uganda, because what we realized was that they need lawyers, they need advocates, they need folks who can speak and use the law on their behalf and work with them to bring attention to the abuses in exile. We also were able to influence policy around freedom of movement, that full recognition and realization of your rights as refugees in exile really hinges on freedom of movement and the ability to leave refugee camps and to make a living for yourself. So we documented all of that. It resulted in a book, and all of that work led me to law school to be a lawyer, to be a practitioner, because I realized the power of a law degree to speak up for those who are vulnerable in situations where they're not citizens, like refugees. And so that led me to law school and ultimately to prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in The Hague in the Yugoslav and Rwandan tribunals. So it was really an amazing opportunity for my life to come full circle, because I had been working with refugees from Rwanda fleeing the genocide, before law school. Eventually, I ended up becoming a international human rights professor here at USC and then now at UCLA, because I'm passionately committed to training the next generation of human rights advocates and to take and harness the power and the passion of new generations and to teach them how to use the powerful tool of a law degree as best they can. It's not as we'll talk soon, it's not a perfect system, but it is one mechanism, international law and human rights mechanisms, for really elevating the voices of those who have suffered the most.
Thank you for that. And I did have the pleasure of being in your class here at USC Gould before you moved across town to UCLA, which was a wonderful experience. My next question is again for both of you. I think some folks in the audience would be very curious to know, because you've been both working on Artsakh for several years. This isn't a new sort of interest area. I'm wondering, how did the Artsakh issue first come to your attention? And maybe, Steve, you can start us off again.
I was on an exchange program sponsored by the State Department for Americans to study human rights issues in Russia. And I didn't know exactly where they were going to send me, and I ended up in southern Russia, in Krasnodar, an area with another Armenian community with deep roots, the Hamshan Armenians. And I started quickly. We were on the borders, the border of Georgia and Abkhazia, which was also had its own experience of refugees fleeing that conflict, and very quickly becoming embedded and interested in the Armenian community. I started to meet refugees, Baku Armenians, other refugees from the war, who welcomed me to come visit Artsakh. And I remember that first trip. There was no border post set up between Armenia and the Republic of Artsakh at that time, and traveling through Agdam, seeing those ruins, and then meeting people in Martuni, in Stepanakert, in Shushi, and seeing that even women were still wearing military fatigues 6 years after, understanding the bravery, the courage, but also the trauma that was present in every person. And like I said earlier, it inspired me, and I began writing about the issue. I began following it, but I realized that it was going to be very complicated. When I was at Human Rights Watch, for example, even human rights organizations, and I think Hannah agrees, there were a lot of constraints. There are a lot of constraints in terms of the international recognition issue. And so finding ways to be involved in the human rights of Artsakh was actually always a complicated task, even for, I think, those of us in the human rights community. But it remained important, and I think, of course, the work of the Institute during 2020 to highlight the atrocities and then really the clear war crimes, the indiscriminate shelling, the bombing of maternity hospitals in Stepanakert, and then the blockade. I think it was sort of this escalating experience of taking the language of international human rights and applying it to what we were seeing, including genocide. And so I think it's been a sort of, it's hard not to go further and further and further into this issue and want to find solutions, especially now for those who are in captivity.
So I'm not an expert on this area of the world, and really didn't know a lot about the region and history of Artsakh and Armenia until my students made sure that I did while I was teaching in 2020 with the start of the 44-day war. There was a real push and activism by our Armenian American law students for the law school to make a statement in support of students and to decry what was happening. And so I really learned from my students about the situation. And from there, we started working together to try and do something about it, to take action. So at USC, I had the privilege of launching the first International Human Rights Clinic, which is a style of pedagogy where you teach law students learning by doing. So they take the theory and doctrine of the law and apply it to practice while they're studying in real time on real cases with real clients. And so some of my students in my international criminal law class, Maral was there, and others, in addition to pushing for that statement coming from the law school, then we worked on a letter to Congress with regard to the Section 907 waiver that had been applied again and again to allow for military assistance to Azerbaijan in violation of the spirit of the law, which is that no military assistance should go to Azerbaijan where they're attacking Armenians and perpetrating serious human rights abuses against ethnic Armenians, which was happening. So we lobbied Congress on that. We wrote a long letter documenting all of the abuses and the attacks and the war crimes and the crimes against humanity as they were unfolding. And then we started doing research into targeted sanctions with regard to leaders in Azerbaijan behind the violence. Subsequent to that, I continued to follow the situation after moving to UCLA and starting up at the Promise Institute. There we had a group of students who went to Armenia with the University Network for Human Rights, and they had sent students every year since 2020 to do fact-finding and to write a report and to document the ongoing violations and serious human rights abuses and international crimes against ethnic Armenians. And so I overtook that project when I started at UCLA, and the students issued their report just before the push out of over 100,000 ethnic Armenians from Artsakh. And so we did an event on that at UCLA, and it was very emotional, traumatizing, I would say, for our students to see all of those individuals that, if they didn't have the opportunity to go to Artsakh itself, but they were in the border towns of Armenia and hearing the stories and then seeing the subsequent complete deportation of so many and complete impunity. But nevertheless, they bravely went up and, in our event and told everyone at the university what it was like and tried to convey as much as possible the voices that they had been interviewing and hearing over the past couple of years. And they issued their report. We also did an event that year on the duty to prevent genocide, seeing that was clearly what was coming with the Lachen corridor blockade, and we brought in experts on the Genocide Convention, and then sent a letter to the Biden administration in the aftermath of September 2023, calling on the administration to take very specific actions, which I'll highlight in a minute. And then I'll just say on top of all of that, so subsequent to my work in the Yugoslav and Rwandan tribunals, I've done a lot of work before the International Criminal Court, which now is very relevant for Armenia and for Artsakh, now that Armenia has become a states party. And Before it became a states party, I had the opportunity to meet with the Armenian ambassador in The Hague and just to press the case for why this is the time for Armenia to take a stand and to declare itself as a states party to the International Criminal Court in the face of such clear international crimes.
Excellent, thank you. Hannah, I'm going to stick with you for my next question. In the aftermath of the dissolution of the Artsakh state apparatus and the complete ethnic cleansing of the Armenian population, could you speak to what avenues for justice can be realistically pursued by and for the people of Artsakh? And I know you're doing some amazing work at the Promise Institute for Human Rights, so I hope you'll speak about the project that you have there.
Certainly. So I had the privilege this fall of visiting and going to Armenia for the very first time at the invitation for the Center for Truth and Justice, which is doing some really great work in documenting and taking testimony, and was able to be a part of a conference of different international law experts pursuing different pathways for justice. So I'll highlight a few of those for you and some that we're trying to work on at the Promise Institute. But I'd just like to make 2 points overall with regard to thinking about realistic avenues for justice. The first is we are here today because of complete impunity from 2020 onward vis-a-vis Azerbaijan and the leadership there. And complete impunity for war crimes, crimes against humanity, potentially genocide, leads to further such abuse. You know, it emboldens and it allowed for and led to the complete deportation of over 100,000 ethnic Armenians. And so that has to end, right? And I think, you know, obviously the history of the Armenian people goes all the way back to the early 1900s and impunity for the genocide there. And so I think it's critical that in thinking about steps for justice, that there be an end to this impunity. And then the other point is that any steps towards justice for impacted communities and ethnic Armenians has to be transformative in nature, in my view, which means it has to come from the ground up and it has to be informed and led first and foremost by Armenians and those who have suffered from the deportation. And so this is really critical in my mind. There's a lot of individuals from outside, like myself, who have ideas. We think we know what justice means, but ultimately it's up to the people who have suffered to tell us what justice looks like for them. In my view, going back to the point about impunity, I do think now with the International Criminal Court and Armenia being a states party, that is a realistic avenue for justice for Artsakh. The Armenian government recognized jurisdiction from May 2021 onwards, so that obviously includes the deportation of September 2023 with regard to Artsakh. And even though Artsakh wasn't recognized by the international community as an independent republic, having its own status and considered to be Azerbaijan territory, who is not a states party to the ICC, the fact that the deportation ended on the territory of a states party, Armenia, gives the International Criminal Court jurisdiction to investigate. And I think now is the opportunity to equip the prosecutor with evidence. So what we need, and something we're exploring, I'm beginning to explore at the Promise Institute, is developing a project for submission of what we call an Article 15 submission. And there's already been one, but that really lays out the case for war crimes, crimes against humanity of deportation, persecution, other inhumane acts with regard to Artsakh, but then also genocide, of course, given the ongoing hate rhetoric that Steve knows so well and has documented over many years, but also the way in which the leadership was targeted and is being detained in Azerbaijan. That's an indicator for genocidal intent. Also, a targeting of cultural heritage and destruction of cultural property is also something we look at. And then also, for genocide, it's destruction, the intent to destroy in whole or in part. And here you have a distinct part of the ethnic Armenian community tied to the land of Artsakh that have clearly been targeted. So Maral this probably all sounds familiar, right, from your notes from international criminal law. But there is a real opportunity to really press the prosecutor's office to start investigations. The other thing I would say is that under the Rome Statute, the founding document of the International Criminal Court, those investigations he would be required, Karim Khan, to actually look into them if a state were willing to refer the situation, a state's party. So it could be Armenia, could be France, could be some other ally, and that would move things along much more quickly. And so I actually had the opportunity to sit next to a French parliamentarian on the way back from Armenia, and she and I plotted a plan to see if we could get the French government to refer the situation. But those are the kinds of strategies that could be possible moving forward. And what we're hoping to do is bring forward, through testimony taking and gathering of evidence, very credible, detailed documentation and fact-finding, build a case, help build a case for the prosecutor. Along those lines, you can see national cases potentially for Artsakh under universal jurisdiction theory or with regard to states parties of the Rome Statute who would have jurisdiction. And then I think that we need to really press for better and more thorough fact-finding through a fact-finding body at the UN level or otherwise, a commission of inquiry, again, to document everything that's been going on. I could go on, but I need to stop there, so.
Thank you. And quite an amazing seating on the plane. I know some people don't like to chat on planes,
Right.
But that sounds like an ideal seat partner to have. My next question is again for both of you, but I'm going to start off with a personal anecdote. I remember during the 2020 war, I was actually enrolled in a human rights seminar here at the law school. And I recall feeling powerless as I watched rampant human rights violations occur in real time against the Armenians of Artsakh, while learning about international human rights law and almost feeling like it was poetry in that moment. In a moment of immense upheaval and conflict around the world, when many people are feeling understandably disillusioned by the international community, by international human rights institutions, why should folks still put their trust in bodies like the International Court of Justice and the UN Human Rights Council? What is your response to the understandable criticism in this moment about the ineffectiveness of these institutions?
Well, I think I shared and echoed some of those concerns in my earlier answer about the constraints that the international human rights community was working under during 2020. There was a sense from the community, I think probably here in this room, a lot of folks would agree that the human rights community wasn't stepping up enough, that there was maybe some both sidesing of the conflict, which was deeply a sense of betrayal and that we weren't doing our part. And I felt that sense of responsibility. When I've been in this field working on a lot of authoritarian governments for a while, and what I tell my students is that the victories actually do happen. Some of them are sitting here. I think they can corroborate what I'm saying. I think about, for example, in another context, working on the deeply authoritarian regime of Uzbekistan, as I have for many years, seeing that every political prisoner that we documented, whose cases we documented, almost every one of them was eventually released because we wouldn't give up. We kept raising their names, and I think we need to say their names. I think about how the U.S. delegation has committed to do that at the upcoming COP29 conference in Baku, at the UN Climate Change Conference. We need to say their names, all 23 or more Armenian political prisoners. We have to remember them. We have to talk about them at every opportunity. So I tell my students that change does happen, pressure does work. Those might sound like slogans, but they really, truly, I think, are the case. So maybe I'll let Hannah answer as well.
So I'm really struck by the word in your question, trust. These institutions, we don't look to them to answer and solve all our problems, right? And it's really understandable when you are victims in the midst of the horrors of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide even, to think that these institutions are letting you down, that that they're failing somehow. It feels like that, and it's certainly, I can understand, in this particular geopolitical moment, feels as if our institutions and human rights mechanisms that were established out of the horrors of the Holocaust following World War II are no longer working, right? But the thing is, they're being used more than ever today by populations around the world who have suffered as much as Artsakh. If you look at Gaza, if you look at other situations, Sudan, They're all, before the International Criminal Court, before the International Court of Justice, UN human rights mechanisms, and civil society, individual attorneys, human rights folks are using them more than ever to bring to the fore the demand for justice. So I don't see them as institutions that we trust to fix our problems. I see them as tools and platforms to go to empower victims, to empower survivors, to be resilient. The biggest cause of trauma is feeling helpless to do anything in the face of your suffering. And the best way to be resilient to it is to take action. And that's why, I am so committed to training the next generation of human rights advocates so that we can work in solidarity with impacted communities and help show them how they can take their, agency back and use these mechanisms to the best that they can, even if they're not working well. But also, for students, young attorneys, impacted communities in the process to figure out creative ways to make them stronger and better. These institutions, they need reworking. They were established a long time ago. And in today's world, we have to be more creative. And advocates and impacted communities are using all the tools in the toolkit and trying as many avenues as possible. And that's what you have to do, and not give up and keep trying. And that is the best antidote to trauma.
Thank you. To close out our panel, I wanted to ask you, Steve, about one of the most urgent human rights concerns for Armenians with regard to the Artsakh issue, which is the status of prisoners of war and civilian captives still being held in Azerbaijan. Could you just speak quickly to what legal channels are being pursued to secure their release?
Yeah, I know we're short on time, so I'll be very quick and say we are 9 days from this extraordinary opportunity, right? It may seem like it is a great sin of the international community to have placed the climate change conference in an oil-rich dictatorship, but we need to use it to stop greenwashing the human rights abuses. We need to, I think, in this context of the United States, one remedy that hasn't been mentioned, we need to use our laws to enact the Magnitsky, what we call the global Magnitsky sanctions on Azerbaijani officials that are responsible for the ethnic cleansing, but also the continued imprisonment of Armenians in Azerbaijan simply for the exercise of their peaceful human rights. So I hope we will use all the available remedies at our disposal, including sanctions, including, as Hannah mentioned, the Section 907 waiver needs to be ended, terminate military aid to Azerbaijan and condition any of it on the release of prisoners and the guarantee of human rights abuses. And I'll just say at the very close, Armenians have a right to self-defense, a right to life. So in the United States, we need to reconsider and re-examine that relationship with Armenia and make sure that all these threats that are facing the sovereignty of Armenia, this maybe continuing genocide, needs to be stopped with American support. Thank you.
Thank you both. It was a real honor to be on stage with both of you, and thank you to our audience for being with us on such a meaningful and special day for the Institute of Armenian Studies.